It's such a pleasure to have you with us. We appreciate your participation and your contribution to this important event. We'd like to share with you the broad objectives for this webinar and also some guidelines to enable your participation. The main objectives here are to develop an understanding of natural systems and processes as key to finding nature-based solutions for resilient infrastructure. We also intend to explore some of the barriers and constraints to nature-based solutions and highlight areas and actions for policy interventions. We intend to present a case study that describes the use of geospatial tools to map changes in mangroves in Tamil Nadu, India. And this case study also assesses the efficacy of nature-based restoration attempts. To enable your full participation, I'd like to review with you a few guidelines. First, thank you for muting your microphone when not speaking. We want you to stay actively engaged and focus your full attention on the webinar, on the speakers, and on your contributions. We're very interested to hear your contributions in the chat box, so please write your ideas, your questions, your suggestions, your resources in the chat box. And you'll also have an opportunity to engage directly with our esteemed panel by using the Q&A function to submit questions to the panelist. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A, and you can select that button to write directly to the panelist who will then respond to your questions. With that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Sandeep Poundrik, Director General for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure in India, and he will offer some welcoming remarks to us. But just a bit of background about Mr. Poundrik. He's been overseeing the work of the CDRI Secretariat since its inception. Additionally, he is posted as Advisor, Mitigation, Natural Disaster Management Authority in India in the rank of Additional Secretary. He's from the Indian Administrative Service, having work experience there for more than 25 years, including work at the national level in the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas and National Disaster Management Authority. He has experience of heading infrastructure departments at state level, including urban development and energy. And he's been associated with international organizations like the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery and the World Bank. And it is such an honor and immense pleasure to have you open this webinar. Mr. Poundrik.
Thank you, Pam, and good morning, good day, and good evening to all the participants. And it's my honor to welcome all the participants in this first pre-event for the International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Can we have the PowerPoint, please? Thank you. So I would just like to take a few minutes of your time to give you the status of CDRI and why are we organizing this webinar in run-up to the international conference. Next. CDRI, or Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, was launched by Prime Minister of India in the UN Climate Action Summit in New York last year in September 2019. CDRI is a multi-stakeholder partnership of country governments, of multilateral organizations, academic institutions, private sector, and other non-governmental organizations with the agenda to take the subject of disaster resilient infrastructure forward The secretariat of the CDRI is based in New Delhi, India. Next. As of today, CDRI has been joined by 18 countries and 4 multilateral organizations. If you see the map on the slide, you can see that countries from almost all the continents of the world are represented in the coalition, from North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and all kind of countries, landlocked countries, small island countries, and countries in various stages of disaster resilient infrastructure have joined the coalition to take this agenda forward. In addition to 18 countries, we have 4 multilateral organizations, including Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, UNDP, and UNDRR, who have joined the coalition on the disaster resilient infrastructure. Next. CDRI has identified 8 thematic areas of work on which the coalition will be working. And as you can see on the slide, that these thematic areas go from governance and policy to risk identification, standards and certification, another very, very important topic, and then capacity development, innovation, finance, and ultimately community awareness and capacity building. So CDRI will be working in these different thematic areas with projects, studies, and knowledge products, which will come in various stages of its development. Next. CDRI has started, next please. CDRI has started the work already in spite of the present challenging COVID-19 situation. We have started work on few projects, starting with a power sector resilience study in the state of Odisha in India, taking the major Fani cyclone of 2019 as a backdrop. We are studying the power sector resilience, and the outputs and outcomes from this study will be taken to similar geographies throughout the world. This study has already started. We are already working on a similar study on disaster resilience of airports in different parts of the world. This study is in advanced stage of launching, and we expect to launch it in by December 2020. Next, please. We are also working on national risk and resilience assessments of various infrastructure sectors, from power to telecom to transport. And we have started working on the first studies, which we will launch by again December 2020. Another very important component of output from CDRI will be the global flagship report. This report will give the status of disaster resilience of infrastructure in the world. It will be a biennial report, and the first report is expected to be out in 2022. We have already started the work on this report with UNDP and other partner countries and organizations. Next, please. CDRI has launched a fellowship program where researchers will be given fellowships of up to US $10,000 to work to research on practical DRI problems. This fellowship program was launched on 15th of September, and the applications are open till 17th of January 2021. We have constituted an international jury to judge the applications, and CDRI will be giving 30 fellowships in its first year. Next, please. Coming to the International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, we have been holding the international workshop on disaster resilient infrastructure, the first of which was organized in 2018 and second in 2019. In 2020, this conference or workshop could not be organized because of the COVID-19 situation, and the next conference will be organized virtually from 17th to 19th March 2021. The conference is planned to be a 3-day event with various sessions on Sendai framework, on global commitments towards disaster resilient infrastructure and sustainable development goals. And I will request all the participants to keep this conference in mind and actively participate in various sessions of this conference. One of the major aspects of CDRI's work profile and this conference is nature-based solutions. And because of that, the first run-up event which CDRI in collaboration with USAID is organizing is today's webinar on nature-based solutions. So I again welcome all the participants on behalf of CDRI to this webinar, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to introduce CDRI to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pandrik, for that brief but very informative orientation to CDRI. You've highlighted the themes, 8 critical themes that your organization will address. And some of those themes will be addressed directly in this meeting: governance and policy, risk identification, resilience. Thank you for that, for highlighting the fellowships and for pointing our attention to your other work and deliverables, especially the conference that will be held virtually next year. We appreciate that wonderful introduction. And now I'd like to briefly introduce Ms. Karen Klamowski. She is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with the U.S. Agency for International Development, and she's worked internationally for over 30 years in Asia, the Pacific Islands, and in Africa. She currently serves as the Acting Mission Director in New Delhi, India, assisting in overseas programs in energy, environment, health, and other issues. So it is with great pleasure, Ms. Klimowski, that we welcome you to this webinar.
So much, Pam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all who have joined us today for this webinar. It is my pleasure to be here representing the United States Agency for International Development, or better known as USAID. For those of you who aren't familiar with the agency, USAID is the United States government's lead development agency responsible for international development and humanitarian work. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the inaugural session of this Nature-Based Solutions webinar. The United States government, through USAID India and the U.S. Forest Service, is pleased to partner with the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure in organizing and supporting this webinar. We all know that webinars are the new normal, and generally I have to say that I've been pleased and satisfied with how successful webinars have been as a platform to share knowledge during these difficult times. The necessity of internet-based solutions has allowed us to connect with experts across the globe to share thoughts and ideas on a given topic, which, although not a completely balanced trade for face-to-face interaction, I think has been a useful compromise. The COVID-19 pandemic is just the latest in a string of monumental disasters. Globally, we are now seeing more climate-related extreme weather events like floods and droughts, increased temperatures, and rise in sea levels across regions. These disasters compel us to transform our models for economic growth and put resilience at the heart of human development. The Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure is an outstanding initiative that I'm confident will be of global value. As development professionals, we all struggle to build resilience into our work. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate the government of India and Prime Minister Modi for establishing this important organization and helping all development practitioners, be it the government, private sector, financial institutions, or other key stakeholders, further the goal of resilient development. Today's topic, nature-based solutions, is grounded in the knowledge that healthy, natural, and managed ecosystems produce a diverse range of services on which human well-being depends. These solutions can and should go beyond disaster risk reduction to something more holistic. Conserving forests and wetlands will protect communities and infrastructure from floods, soil erosion, and landslides, but can also secure and regulate water supplies, support the production of forest products, and bring in revenue from ecotourism. Planting trees in cities can moderate the impact of heat waves and capture stormwater, as well as abate pollution. Protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems such as mangrove forests, salt marshes, and reefs protect communities and infrastructure from storm surges and erosion. These efforts also sequester carbon, which we know contributes to climate change mitigation. Such measures also have positive outcomes for mental and physical health. So we can see that the potential here is much greater than protecting infrastructure from floods and cyclones. Nature-based solutions for resilient infrastructure can contribute to an equitable and sustainable future for humanity. The barriers and challenges related to this are uncertain. However, we can overcome these barriers and challenges by building capacity at multiple levels and among multiple stakeholders. Implementing and assessing different ecosystem-based adaptation approaches, and mainstreaming ecosystem-based adaptation initiatives into policies, to name just a few approaches. Today, we have 4 separate speakers who have very rich experience working in this space. I request the webinar participants to actively participate in today's discussion, as this will feed into the 3rd International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure that Sandeep mentioned, that will be held from 17th to 19th of March in 2021. To deliberate on international commitments that are significant for building disaster and climate resilient infrastructure. I look forward to our fruitful discussion on this very important subject. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Klimowski. Thank you for those encouraging words and for highlighting the fact that we're at a unique moment in time that calls upon us to transform the way that we work, partner, and problem solve in order to address and build a reduced disaster risk reduction. It's such a pleasure to have you. We appreciate those opening remarks. Thank you so very much. And now I'm delighted to introduce you to the moderator for our technical session today, Mr. Kamal Kashore. He's a member of India's National Disaster Management Authority, NDMA, and the Indian co-chair of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Executive Committee. He's worked on DRR and recovery issues for over 22 years at the local, national, regional, and global levels. And prior to joining NDMA, Mr. Kishore worked with the UNDP for nearly 13 years in New Delhi, in Geneva, and in New York, leading global advocacy campaigns to address disaster risk reduction concerns in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and the post-2015 development agenda. So it is with immense pleasure that I turn over the microphone to Mr. Kishore.
Thank you very much, Pam. I am delighted to be here with all of you and have this opportunity to moderate this, what is going to be an exciting discussion on nature-based solutions. Already in the chat box, there are comments coming from as far as the Caribbean, raising really pertinent questions. We've put together an excellent panel with a wide variety of experience, ranging from policy level work to community level work, ranging from application of technologies, geospatial technologies, to deep knowledge of ecosystems at the local level, deep understanding of coastal ecology, experiences from a variety of geographies. So this is going to be a really fruitful and very rich discussion. So let me begin by introducing the four panelists and one commentator before we start the discussions. We have with us Dr. Prashant Hedao. He's a visiting scientist at the University of California at Davis. He's a landscape architect. He is a GIS specialist who has explored application of GIS in a variety of contexts, from urban planning to nature-based solutions to environmental monitoring. Currently, he is also supporting WHO in georeferenced, geotagged analysis of the health systems in the context of COVID-19. Then we have Dr. Anand Patwardhan. He is a professor at the School of Public Policy at University of Maryland. He's a coordinating lead author for the IPCC, decades of experience, policy level experience, also deep technical experience. He currently he is a champion of the cause of climate change adaptation. He is a co-chair of the Science Committee of the World Adaptation Science Program. Delighted to have him with us for this webinar. Then we have Dr. Shuvankar Ghosh. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the French Institute of Pondicherry. He specializes in understanding the dynamics of coastal wetlands using geospatial tools. He has studied carbon flux. He studied how invasive species behave in different environments and what we can do about them. We have then Dr. Nicolas Bautes. He's a research fellow at the French Institute of Pondicherry. He focuses on people, city makers, looks at how social memories of artisans work. Currently, he is working in the coastal areas of Tamil Nadu in India, looking at fishermen's well-being through research projects. So really deep work on interaction between infrastructure, green infrastructure, and people. And then finally, we have as our commentator, Dr. Erika Svendsen. She's a research social scientist with the United States Forest Service Northern Research Center based in New York. She looks at social and spatial interaction, the notion of stewardship for protecting the environment, and so on. So rich experience from a variety of contexts, a very people-centric approach to understanding nature-based solutions. We are very excited to have her with us today. She will be commenting on the four presenters that we have this afternoon. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is how the technical session is laid out for you today. We will have a planning level discussion, which Dr. Prashant Hedao will talk about, and the role of nature-based solutions in it. We'll follow that up with a talk by Dr. Anand Patwardhan. He will specifically focus on policy issues, challenges with regards to scaling. You have this wonderful root bridge and nature-based, green infrastructure on the slide in front of you. But how do you take to scale some of these things? And then we'll go deep down into the specific case. One case of Pichavaram mangroves played a huge role at the time of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, where we'll hear what happened in terms of spatio-temporal changes over the last couple of decades, what are the lessons and what implications it has for integrating green and gray infrastructure. Then we'll invite some question and answers from the audience, and then we'll invite Dr. Erika Svendsen to synthesize the discussion. With that, I turn the mic over to Dr. Prashant Hedao.
Thank you, Kamal, for the kind introduction. I would like to thank CDRI for organizing this and inviting me for this talk. So let's move into look at what does infrastructure mean. When we think of infrastructure, we think of bridges, buildings. We think of next slide, please. We think of roads, railroads. We think of transportation corridors, but there is also a second kind of infrastructure, which is called the social infrastructure, which includes hospitals, schools, and other institutions. And then there is nature. Nature has given us certain infrastructures which we can use very effectively. And here is an example of tanks of South India, which was built in the Cholas period, almost 4 centuries ago, which shows these dotted blue dots of tanks that are built all across southern India peninsula that holds the water that we get during 3 months of the rains. Next slide, please. Today, the world has recognized that we have to have a sustainable future. We cannot continue extracting resources the way we have been monitoring it, the way we've been exploiting it. So in 2015, it just happened in the same year. There were several agreements, global agreements signed, the Paris Agreement for Climate Change, SDGs for Sustainable Development, and also the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction that Mr. Pondicherry talked about. And this was one of the things that actually shows the world's commitment towards having a sustainable world. Next slide, please. So number 9 in the SDGs, which talks about industry, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. And if we do that right, we would actually have number 3, achieve number 3, which would be good health and well-being, number 13, which would be largely with the climate, and have protected marine and terrestrial biodiversity, and also have sustainable communities and cities. And that actually all this requires the number 17, which is the key, which requires partition, requires partnerships among different departments, across the countries, across international boundaries. Next slide, please. So I was fortunate to have studied under a professor who actually did a lot of work in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and wrote a landmark book in 1969 called Design with Nature. And its message was very simple. And it was actually very simple at that time, but it was not something that was on people's mind, which is environment and the pollution that we were putting in. And he was a little ahead of his time. He actually his message was very simple, that whatever we do has to be based on the understanding of the natural processes. And that is what I have tried to do in my work. And this is what I would like to see present as the NBS. Thank you. Next slide. So where do we build infrastructures? And that's quite straight away directly linked to where people live. As you can see, the global distribution of human population is not even. There are denser areas, there are areas where you cannot live, areas where you can live. And that actually links directly to what is happening on the ground over there. Next slide, please. And that shows the major habitat types actually that is directly linked to where people live. There are deserts, there are colder areas, there are thick rainforests, grasslands, and uninhabitable areas that makes it very difficult to live. And that's what human beings have actually found the right place to live and where they want to live. And over the years, they have gone into areas where they could have avoided, and that's has resulted in different things like the fires and other things. Next slide, please. This map shows the human influence on the globe. The dark red color shows how much of the globe we have actually influenced. That this is a combination of several factors, such as the population densities, the built spaces, access, which is the transportation corridors, including river navigation, and also the night lights, or satellite imagery of night lights that you may have seen. It's quite a popular image of the world. Next slide, please. And we also know that over the years, we know which areas are to be protected. There have been studies by Conservation International, the World Wildlife Fund, which have talked about areas that are really, really important for biodiversity conservation. And it's not just about saving species, it's about saving critical natural resources for our own survival, including water security. The one on the top shows the global biodiversity hotspots by Norman Myers and Conservation International. The one below shows the global 200 ecoregions from World Wildlife Fund. conservation science program. Our environment and people's aspiration and economic growth has to go hand in hand, and we cannot leave any of them behind. Next slide, please. I'll go through a series of examples. Here is an example from one of the global biodiversity hotspots, the Western Ghats, which spans across west coast of southern India. And that actually is a rainforest area, supports a large diversity of species, but also 7 major rivers originate from the Western Ghats. So Western Ghats is not just important for biodiversity, but also the water security of millions of people living in South Indian peninsula whose agriculture is supported by these rivers, waters. And the earlier slide I showed you about the tanks of South India were built exactly to capture these water that is flowing eastwards on the Deccan Plateau from the Western Ghats to the Bay of Bengal. And that's what the whole idea of building water infrastructure, pond infrastructure was that, and it still works after over 300 years, it still works. The picture on the right is the origin of River Kaveri, which is one of the major rivers in South India, in the Coorg district in Karnataka. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. Yeah, so there's also another issue that has come up over the years, and which is very severely constraining our growth and our ways we put infrastructure, is the human-wildlife conflict. We have gone into areas and converted areas for human use and built infrastructure in places where, and that has actually constricted the wildlife habitat, and that the reason, and as a result of that, they have actually gone way beyond. The map on the left shows the state of Karnataka in Tamil Nadu, in southern India, which show the dark outlined areas are the protected areas, the green are the forested areas, and the beige color shows how far the elephants have gone beyond. So you can see that elephants have gone way beyond the protected areas and forested areas into human habitation. So we have to think twice before we put any infrastructure in any place, which may be actually obstructing their view, the area of the migration paths, and maybe diverting them into areas where they've not gone before. Next slide, please. Here is an example of New York's Staten Island. The image on the left, the black and white on the lower left, shows the areas unsuitable for urbanization, which are the dark areas. And the map on the right are the areas which were hit by Hurricane Sandy in 2012, the orange areas. And so you can see that exactly the areas that were predicted in 1969 were the ones affected. So we do have ways to predict where we can build and where we should not build. Next slide, please. This slide shows the Bihar floods from 2008. There was a breach in the river Kosi levees, and that diverted the water back to where it used to flow 50, 60 years ago. And over the years, as you can see, if you look beyond the Kosi River, where it enters India from Nepal, you can see the watershed, how big the watershed of Kosi River is. It is almost 1/3 the size of Nepal, and the red areas are degraded landscapes, which results in faster flow, faster running down of the water in a large quantity, and also carrying silt, and that has affected our infrastructure controlling the water, and that's something that we need to do. So here's an example where sometimes you have to go beyond country boundaries and have international collaborations, and sometimes several countries across, because watershed boundaries are way beyond the national boundaries. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. Yeah. So here's an example of another example from 2004 Asian tsunami, which one of the villages on the sandbar on the coast was relocated into the away from the coast, but was actually relocated into the backwaters. And the road that was built over there in the red color that you see, the road actually resulted in flooding of the village. So first they got hit by tsunami, and then they got hit by the floods. And as you will hear more from in the next presentation about the Pichavaram mangroves, which is there on the lower right side, that area was actually a larger area which used to cover a lot of these backwaters. This is actually the Kaveri Delta where it meets the ocean, the Kaveri River where it meets the ocean. Next slide, please. And actually the regeneration of landscape, we have done quite a successful landscape regeneration in Oroville. On the left, it shows the eroded canyons and the eroded plateau, that how it was in 1972. On the right, it shows how it can be restored and how it has been restored today. Next slide, please. And actually the restoration work was done well, but but when actually urbanization expands, you end up in a very, very different constricted waterways, which actually should have been ideally used for flood mitigation. And what should be on the right could have been used for passive recreation, green lungs of the city, and that's how the green infrastructure should be preserved. Next slide, please. As we'll see from the examples that I showed, there was a common thread, which is the geographic information system and the mapping technology that was used in the work that I had presented earlier. It actually lets you look at the data, analyze, visualize, and actually use it as a decision-making tool. So you are actually making a science-based decision, and understanding of the natural resources, natural processes is really important, and GIS helps you in that. Next slide, please. Even the SDGs have actually created a new hub site for the SDGs so that all the countries can actually have access to real-time data. You can have data from satellite imagery, spreadsheets, other live data, real-time data like weather and the pollution data, and also the LiDAR data that can be used. And these are the data that help you actually build up the base for looking at understanding the nature. Next slide, please. And I would like to end with a key message saying that understanding the natural systems is the key. We today have technologies such as GIS and big data, and we are actually flooded with data, and we can actually use it judiciously in analysis and decision making. Environment and people's aspiration and economic growth should go hand in hand. And this is a message that we need to understand is that today the nature is actually coming back to us. We have exploited that enough, and the urban flooding, the human-wildlife conflict is an indication that nature is giving us signals that I'm going to come back and reclaim my habitat, reclaim my areas that you have overtaken. And that is something that we have to do. So we have actually no choice but to plan with nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prashant. That was an excellent presentation. I think there are three big takeaways. I think the first point you mentioned that the work that we are doing on resilient infrastructure, gray and green, has implications not just for SDG 9, but across the board. It has a very large leverage in all aspects of human well-being. The second point you repeated again and again, that if you don't give nature space, is going to take that space that you're occupying. And you illustrated that through examples of Hurricane Sandeep, Bihar floods, the tsunami, and so on. And finally, you ended on an optimistic note that there is enough science. We can take a scientific evidence-based approach to actually guide our work on preservation on nature-based resources, or you can call it green infrastructure or ecological infrastructure, and so on. So with that, let's ask the audience to answer a question, a quick participants rapid poll. It would appear on your screen, and you can just answer that. The question is posed by Prashant. I would encourage everyone to vote now. Answer your, participate in the poll, answer the question. Well, I mean, overwhelmingly, yes. Does traditional knowledge have a role in understanding the natural systems that are key to any successful nature-based solutions? Overwhelmingly, people feel that we have to take into account the traditional knowledge. But how do we do that on scale? And that is the kind of stuff that our next speaker, Dr. Anand Patwardhan, is going to talk about. He has been at the forefront of global adaptation efforts, focusing on post-extreme events recovery, as well as focusing on the role of nature-based solutions. Dr. Anand Patwardhan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kamal, and a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on this webinar. Thanks very much to CDRI and USFS for inviting me to speak here. I think this builds very nicely on the previous talk, where I think Prashant emphasized the importance of evidence. And what my talk will do is suggest that in addition to evidence about biophysical changes, evidence about the socioeconomic side of the equation is equally important when it comes to the question of how do we take these solutions to scale, building on from the number of good examples that we have around us. Next slide, please. So there's really sort of three key messages. I think the first key message should come as really no surprise to this audience, that indeed the natural environment is the underpinning and the foundation for resilient and sustainable economies. And if we forget that, we do that at our own peril, as we are discovering now. The second message is that despite a lot of good examples, pilot projects, some evidence, although I would say that the evidence is still not adequate or conclusive, what we see in practice is, of course, that there is significant underinvestment in nature-based solutions or in natural infrastructure. And a lot of that underinvestment is because of barriers and constraints, and I'll talk a little bit about that further in the course of this presentation, related to understanding, related to policy and institutional weaknesses, and of course, lack of resources or finance, which should be a theme in my talk. I would like to then argue for the third message, which is what do we do about it? And this comes from the work that I was involved in as part of the Global Commission on Adaptation, which basically argued that we need three revolutions. We need a revolution in understanding, a revolution in planning, how we plan and execute and take decisions, and a revolution in finance if we have to overcome these barriers and take solutions to scale. Next, please. So as a policy analyst and economist, when I look at nature-based solutions, I find that the economics are actually highly favorable. So again, some work that we had done for the Global Commission. If you look at the available base of evidence on studies that have quantified costs and benefits, if you look at, for example, protecting mangroves, we have benefit cost ratios that go as high as 9:1, or with an average of about 5.8, which means that these should be really, even from an economic perspective, these should be solutions that should be quite obvious and they should be readily deployed. Next. And it's not just quantified monetary benefits, and we know that NBS generates significant co-benefits, particularly in terms of social and environmental benefits. And as was pointed out earlier, we're not just talking about one SDG, potentially we're talking about benefits from multiple development goals. Next, please. But despite some evidence of the favorable economics, why doesn't favorable economics translate into bigger deployment at scale? And there are a number of barriers and constraints, starting with the fact that we often have a lack of awareness or understanding, and also associated entrenched attitudes, norms as to how we view green infrastructure vis-a-vis the built environment. There is evidence, but the evidence that will persuade decision makers in ministries of finance and planning, which is about the economics and about the viability, is often limited. And that's something that makes us harder to make that case for deployment at scale. Policy and regulatory environments and governance challenges that make it harder to deploy these approaches at across temporal and spatial scales. And of course, the question of finance and technical capacity. Next, please. So to look a little bit more deeply at these barriers, the problem with favorable economics is that it is often not translated into solving the problem of who will pay for it, and how will the person paying for it actually get a return on that investment, especially if we are thinking about private investment in addition to public finance. And I think this is where we do need to do more work in sorting through the benefits. Yes, there are benefits, but some of them are local, some of them are global, some of them are private, some are public, some are short-term, many or most are long-term. And really getting a handle on these different benefit streams and how do we actually effectively identify, capture, and in some cases transfer those benefits so that it will provide a return to an investor, whether a public investor or a private investor, becomes central. Right? So just because we have favorable economics doesn't mean we have solved the problem of getting the finance at the scale that we need. Next, please. And as we think about the space of solutions, I think the other challenge that we have to overcome is finding the right balance, finding the solutions and focusing on the solutions that deliver both in terms of well-being, because that is what will generate economic value, but also benefits to nature, and finding that sweet spot of solutions that maximize or help us target both sets of benefits is critical. Next, please. Nature does not respect administrative or political boundaries, but administrative or political boundaries are in fact what we have to work with when we start thinking about deploying solutions, because those constrain often our ability to look at nature as an integrated whole and implement a landscape-based approach, which is precisely what we need. Jurisdictions, conflicts around sector silos, whether it's water resources versus irrigation versus land use planning, coastal zone management, and those silos need to be overcome if we have to deploy at scale. Next. A good place perhaps to start with is places where we have a unified approach possible. So cities, I would say, are an attractive, or urban areas an attractive place to start thinking about solutions at scale. And in fact, there are many very good examples of solutions that have been deployed for a variety of purposes where natural infrastructure is increasingly being used and tapped. Next, please. So what would a strategy for NBS look like? Really underpinning these three key elements of improving our understanding of the value of nature, embedding those solutions into our planning and policy, the approach of mainstreaming, and increasing the flow of finance and investment in NBS. Next. This is really showing the same idea that we start with the base of evidence, lead into enabling policy environments, and those hopefully lead to wider adoption of NBS. Next. So in closing, what I've tried to do is kind of outline the elements of a strategy, but how do we put that strategy into practice? And I think a way forward for putting that strategy into practice might be to target specific sectors and systems where there is some robust evidence and examples of practice, whether it's water supply, urban stormwater management, coastal protection. These are sectors and systems and applications where there are relatively a better base of evidence. But then we need to invest in platforms and interventions for building further that base, for knowledge sharing, learning, and capacity building. We need to think about using policies creatively, whether it's public procurement policies, whether it's standards, or whether it's incentives to stimulate finance, to stimulate that market creation. And then, of course, we have to be able to blend different sources of investment and public-private partnerships if you really need to take solutions to scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. That was excellent, and a lot of food for thought there. Many takeaways, but three big ones. You started out by telling us that although everyone agrees that nature-based solutions are important, despite the fact that we know that the cost benefit for nature-based solutions is much better than, say, gray infrastructure. Yet there is big underinvestment in it, and even when we make an economic case, the tricky thing is that who invests and who benefits, and how do we sort that out? And you closed your talk by presenting some ideas on how we could address this. So with that, let's go to the question that you've posed for our participants. So the question is, should we mandate use of natural infrastructure over hard infrastructure wherever possible? That's a very provocative question. Should we, if we can avoid sort of gray infrastructure and let green infrastructure provide the service that we need, should we avoid building hard infrastructure? So let's hear from the audience. Everybody, please poll your views on this. Yes, the overwhelming, yes, 93%, but then how do you actually operationalize it? And that's towards the end of Anand's talk, that's what he was trying to address. And in the chat box, you know, which is buzzing with a lot of activity, a lot of questions have come up raising these issues that, you know, one of the barriers, you know, Sunny Hegelios raises that one of the barriers is that the rights over some of these nature-based resources are not very clear. They're contested. So it's not a very clean situation. There is also the issue of how do we bring in culture into it? How do we invoke, you know, a very nice comment from Bhutan, that how do we draw upon our cultural resources to actually work with nature-based solutions? So we'll have more chance to discuss this. But let me now turn over to our colleagues from the French Institute of Pondicherry, Shuvankar Ghosh and Dr. Nicolas Bautes. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I am Nicolas Bautes. So first of all, I would like to warmly thank all of you, colleague panelists and organizers, and also the people who attend this seminar. Actually, many of the very core issues related to the subject today has already been identified and very clearly, I guess, and I'm very happy that we can go further on that kind of discussion through the case studies my colleague Shuvankar will present. So I will very briefly introduce that and just set up the context in which the case study has been undertaken. Actually, I said that I share most of the concern made by Prashant and Anand. So thanks for that. And I like to share and add a bit in the same line of concern. And that is the kind of same attempt and effort to make towards both producing scientific evidences and going towards a more integrated approach. So by integrated, we all, usually say integrated in terms of disciplines and trying to be able to enable a kind of interdisciplinary approach, but also to provide, along with the scientific evidences on several kinds of phenomena which interact in coastal dynamics, make them vulnerable. But we also try to go a step forward, trying to approach, to have a people approach, if I can say. So, which is very nicely said when it's like, it's said like traditional knowledge and all that, but which is kind of the more complex thing to achieve, due first to our proper institutional norms, concerns and all that, and also our kind of habits we have in terms of analyzing in silos, as it was mentioned. So this effort requires long run investigation, in-depth investigation and specific tools to enable a work of co-production, to be able to raise the concerns of the people who are suffering directly from the rapid changes affecting the coastal zones, and also, of course, disasters. So we are deeply involved in that through a research project I have the chance to coordinate, which is called Fisher Coast, Coastal Transformations and Fisher Wellbeing. This is done through a comparative studies between eastern and western coast of India. And my team here at the French Institute is focusing mainly on the Coromandel coast. That stretches for almost 360 kilometers in Tamil Nadu and hosts more than 30% of the state's population. So along with this rising population and demand for natural resources, processes such as rapid urbanization, industrialization and infrastructure development have been highly modifying the coastal landscape, both in terms of morphology and socio-economic profiles. So more specifically, it also threatens not only the critical coastal ecosystems such as marshes and mangroves, but also the sustainability of the dependent fishermen communities, which remain a major source of employment business, and revenue, and which makes also Tamil Nadu the leading state both in culture and natural fisheries, and a major exporter of marine products. So in sum, the morphology of both seashore and land is a fast-changing environment due to growing artificializing of the shoreline, implantation of groins, walls, jetties, and private ports. You can go next, sorry. So this artificialization is also concerned its direct hinterland due to the industrial concentration and power plant, which questions the very political choices made in this area, which is has been declared as a kind of very rapid and very central industrial hub of the country. Construction of roads, ports, infrastructure. So it is, of course, futile to understand coastal process in isolation. Therefore, our project and our approach aims at understanding the different types of processes, ecological, socioeconomic, and of course, political at different scales, interacting to transform this milieu. This is implemented by conducting specific studies on socio-ecological and industrial changes before combining them through an integrated approach. Next, please. So our aim is therefore to focus on the very complexity and dynamism of social, political, institutional, and also ecological change across coastal space. So we draw, and just as an introduction to Shuvankar's presentation, our specific objective are to draw the main features of both the changes which are affecting this coastal morphology and the resulting transformations of both the fishery sectors, being due to natural processes or urbanization or industrialization. And finally, the emergence of new thrust areas for marine and coastal development. So next, please. So the idea is creating evidences which are based on deep investigation. One example will come, and also trying to create tools to be able to share and get feedbacks from the people themselves. Due to the fact that, of course, a lot of investigation showed that most of the most concerned people are not aware, neither on the political agenda, which is coming next for the implementation of any infrastructure, neither nor involved in any part of the creation of the recent history of these spaces. So we do kind of a very different investigation, and I don't have the time here to develop, but I would like to just to give a small example. We are involved in around the mangrove area to recreate the memory of the several disasters happening in the last 40 or 50 years. So, and if so, it's an ongoing process. But if you go through that history, you have a very different history than the political narrative can just like create. And we are trying to confront these two histories to be able to focus more precisely on the local scale. And so we are positioned at the kind of before any kind of implementation of infrastructure projects. So that's where our position as scholar and as scientific people are needed, I think. So this last slide presents the different perspectives we are trying to frame in the project. I don't describe them, and I will let now the Shuvankar presenting specifically the case of Pichavaram mangrove. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nicolas. Well, as he mentioned that this is actually a subset of the bigger Fisher Coast project, and we are trying to, our work package specifically looks at spatiotemporal changes in the coast, including mangrove areas such as Pichavaram. The Pichavaram mangroves are actually located in the coastal Tamil Nadu. It covers close to 1,000 hectares, and despite facing significant threats from both anthropogenic forces such as developmental pressures landward, as well as natural forces such as cyclone, landfall, as well as tsunami, the mangroves continue to provide valuable ecosystem service to the surrounding fishermen community and the broader environment. And therefore, the proper conservation of this mangrove habitat is, of course, crucial. Next slide, please. Now, the Tamil Nadu Forest Department had implemented fishbone plantations for restoring mangroves in Pichavaram since the beginning of the millennium. However, we constantly require to monitor this mangrove habitat, not only to assess the success of such measures, but also identifying areas of new mangrove decay and for facilitating restoration measures in those areas. And finally, trying to investigate what are the possible implications of such restoration efforts towards the conservation of the mangroves in general and development of the dependent of the fishermen community well-being. Next slide, please. And it's here that the use of remote sensing and geospatial tools come very handy, and using very high resolution images, we can quantitatively assess the success of the restoration measures so far. As it turns out, the overall mangrove cover of Pichavaram has shown improvement, specifically the mangroves that have been manually planted by the management, and with fishbone plots implemented prior to 2003 and between 2003 and 2011, showing improvement in mangrove cover, which is good news. Next slide, please. However, the rationale of the implementation of some of these restoration measures in recent times needs to be justified. Now, this is an area in South Pichavaram where we see mangroves coming back over the years, but naturally. However, a couple of years back, the Forest Department decided to construct fishbone plots in the same area, and that too over salt pans. Now, we need to ask whether this step was actually necessary, because it might be detrimental as it will allow the hypersalinity to spread in the emerging mangroves, which might affect their growth and survival. Next slide, please. Further, this is a spot in central Pichavaram, where on left we observe Avicennia, which is a mangrove species growing naturally. However, right in front of it, we observe Rhizophora plantations. And the question here arises that should we at places allow restoration to take place naturally rather than interfering with artificial plantations? Further, if artificial restoration is the way forward, wouldn't it be more wise to take into account the environmental factors such as choice of suitable species or choice of suitable areas for implementing the nature-based solution? Because one other, just go forward. One other area of concern is the construction of check dams for prevention of saltwater intrusion so that the water can be used for agriculture and aquaculture purposes. However, these check dams are also inevitably blocking the fresh water inflow into the mangroves that is so crucial for its survival. Now, if fishbone plantations or the nature-based solutions here are constructed in an already hypersaline environment, it might be detrimental to the growth of emergent mangroves, forcing changes in the mangrove community, and in worst case, result in tree mortality and mangrove loss, which can be disastrous in the long run, specifically to the fishermen community who are dependent on the sustainability of the mangroves. Next slide, please. So although we have seen that the implementation of the nature-based solution so far has been overall successful, on the ongoing in the future measures that need to be more judicious, and it might be wise to include both the scientific community as well as the stakeholders, such in this case, the dependent fishermen community in the decision making, because they know the area better than everyone else. We need to monitor the mangrove ecosystem continuously for identifying possible threats and issues using both field, which will collect the socioeconomic data, as well as the geospatial data, which will try to assess the mangrove changes, the physical changes in mangroves. In addition, we need to do a comprehensive threat analysis by studying and combining all the factors, so socioeconomic and political, ecological data, which will hopefully assist in effective policy formulation and identification of roadblocks towards its implementation. And finally, we do need support from the government, of course, and initiatives such as CDRI, not only in terms of patronizing the research ideas and supporting research ideas, but also prioritizing action for reduction of disaster risk by bringing stakeholders from both government, private, and public sectors together, and ultimately contributing towards the conservation and sustainable future of not only the mangrove ecosystem in general, but also the dependent fishermen community and its blue economy. So that's pretty much from our side. Next slide, please. We would like to thank the Fisher Coast Initiative and the EQUIP, as well as the Tamil Nadu Forest Department so far for their support. And also we'd like to thank the CDRI, USAID, and the USFS for providing us the platform to put forward our research ideas and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola and Shuvankar. That was a very interesting presentation. I also noticed that the poll question that the previous speaker, Anand, asked has created a lot of discussion in the chat box. I think that is indeed what was required. So it's not either or gray and green. It is a combination. So there will be more opportunity to discuss this. But I think very, very important takeaways, Nicola, when you're talking about multiple histories, looking at not just the environmental processes, but also social, economic, political processes, industrial development processes concurrently, and looking at how they influence each other is the only way we can do it. We can't just be in our own bubble and focus on on our own areas of interest. And this whole Pichavaram's the case study is very interesting about how the forest department has taken the initiatives. What are some of the successes? What are some of the things we still need to study and understand better? I think that's a nice segue for the poll question that Shuvankar and Nicolas have put before us. So the question is, should we allow nature to restore itself, or should we go ahead with artificial restoration? I think this is also going to put the chat box on fire. But for now, please respond to the question. Oh, this is interesting. This is not in the 90s. So there are 62% who says artificial restore itself, and more than a third say that artificial restoration is the way. But I guess in the chat box, people will say that it can't be either or. You have to do both and continue to monitor that. So with that, I think we can move on to the Q&A. We have lots of questions. We are already way behind schedule. So what I propose to do is I will combine some of the questions that we have and give each of the three talks one question each now itself, and then we come for another round if there is time. So I think the first question I would like to direct to Prashant. There is a very vivid description of what happened in Kerala in the context of COVID by Professor Vinod Menon. He talks about how some COVID facilities were affected by flood waters, and that is likely to have happened because of deterioration of ecosystems around that. So the flood wasn't managed well. So the question I have is, and there's somebody called Payal in our audience today who has also raised this question. So, and Prashant, you've been working with WHO on the pandemic as well right now. So the question is that, what is it that we can learn from the pandemic in the context of resilient infrastructure, and more specifically nature-based infrastructure or ecological infrastructure? And when we build back better from the current pandemic, what is it that we should be looking at? What should guide our this thing? So while you think about this, let me turn to the second question, which I would like to direct to Anand, where basically it is about, I think on gray and green infrastructure, you've answered that question in the chat box, so I will not pose it again. There are a few questions. One question, when there are shared climate hotspots, when there are shared hotspots across boundaries, there was an example from a colleague from Bangladesh that Sundarbans are not just Bangladesh, it's Bangladesh and West Bengal in India. At the same time, at the local level, there was a question from Seni Hegelios that one of the barriers is that the rights around the nature-based resources are disputed. So what kind of solutions do we find where where basically nature-based solutions are sort of a contested terrain. So I think that's the question for you. The question for our colleagues from the French Institute of Pondicherry are as follows. You talked about a science-based approach, evidence-based approach. You talked about continuous monitoring of the systems. Yet, the speakers who spoke before you talked about the fact that sometimes even the evidence is not enough to be able to make the kind of change. Now that you are on the front lines, in the sense that you're working in a specific location, working with multiple processes, how do we make sure that the evidence that we generate for investment in nature-based solutions is actually used? There is a question which repeatedly came from Mr. Parashar in the chat box, saying that how do we manage the uncontrolled urbanization? How can we make a case that unplanned urbanization is contrary to nature-based solution? So I think these are the three sets of questions I would like to put before you. Prashant, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kamal. That's a very interesting question. So the pandemic, the human-wildlife conflict, urban flooding, where the water comes into our urban areas, are actually a clear signals from the nature that you guys have done enough of destruction and extraction and encroached on my area, as in nature's area. And now I'm coming back to take my, if you don't change your ways, if you don't change your ways you plan, you don't change your ways you deal with the nature or you deal with the earth, you are going to get hit by this. So this is I use this term in my dissertation called reverse extraction. So this is a nature's way of telling us, very clear, it's very clear. It gave a subtle signal in 2005. There were floods in Bombay, there were floods in Pune, there were floods in Chennai. But now it's flooding in every city. It's not just in India, it's happening everywhere. This is nature's way of nature's way of coming back to us, saying that please fix your way of living, otherwise we are going to come back. And this pandemic is also one of the examples that we're getting just too close to the wildlife. We're getting too close to water floodplains. We're building in floodplains. We're getting too close to the wildlife habitat, and this is exactly what we are doing. So in a way, the pandemic gives us a signal that also tells us that that are we doing the things the way if we had continued the way, we would continue to extract resources. And there are numbers which tells you that we may need 1, 2, 3, or 4 Earths maybe to actually survive the kind of population pressures and consumerism and other things that we are that we are getting used to. And this is our way of nature's way of pushing us back a little bit. Okay, you don't learn lesson, next time it will be even more severe. It's very clear. According to me, it's very clear. I was in Siberia several years ago, and there was this person in 1999, and that person there said that, you guys may be discussing climate change, but it's actually happening here. The permafrost, our cities are sinking because the permafrost is melting. In Siberia, the cities are sinking because the topsoil is just melting. So there are areas which experienced it way early. They got the signals. We are getting it later, and if we don't learn from the signal, we'll get even worse hit again. So that's the very clear signal that nature is giving to us. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Prashant. Can I turn over to Anand now?
Thank you. So thank you, Kamal, and great questions, and really glad to see the conversation in the chat box. But just very quickly to respond, since we are running short on time. On the first aspect of the first question was really about the question of boundaries. And I think this is where regional collaboration becomes so critical, right? If you look at the Sundarbans, there is no way that one can think about either a conservation agenda or a resilience agenda without having mechanisms for regional collaboration and cooperation. So that's, I think, pretty clear. Which then the question about rights and contestation, I think in part this is because of the sort of two quick points I would make here. The first is if we remember the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, a key element of the CBD was access and benefit sharing. The whole logic was that, in fact, yes, there is a global public good, which is biodiversity, but these global public goods also are giving local benefits to people. And if we don't have equitable access and equitable benefit sharing, then no solution will be viable, right? So I think this is something we have to really keep in mind, which then leads me to the point that we often think about when we talk about ecosystem-based adaptation. I often have, for the conservationists, this is about how do we enable nature to become more resilient and how do we protect nature. For the economic planner, it's about how do you use ecosystems to increase this resilience of human societies. And these two agendas need to be aligned much more closely, because they are, in fact, right, that by deploying nature-based solutions for resilience of society, we can also create the conditions for investing in the resilience and conservation of nature itself. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Anand. That was, I think your initial remarks and the question itself was provocative, and it really generated a lot of discussion. And the point you're making about, nature-based solutions generating global public goods, but also local level benefits, I think that is a very key one. And I think I saw in the chat box Professor Menon making the same point. There is also the point that Ronald Jackson is making here, which sort of resonates with what you just said, that, when we talk about gray-green infrastructure, there are so many areas where gray infrastructure, the environment, the coastal environment, for example, doesn't have the carrying capacity for for absorbing big gray infrastructure. So we really have to look at it in an integrated way. The conservationist and the economic planner needs to sit at the same table and not be in different rooms. So with that, now let me turn to Nicolas and Shuvankar, please.
Yes, thank you. Actually, this question is, first is, if we knew how to do, we would have done that before. But more seriously, I do think that each position is very important, and I really do believe, and even though it's kind of very difficult, because sharing vocabularies, sharing like disciplinary approach, tools and techniques, we are all with our own vocabulary and way of thinking. But I do feel that collaboration and the creation of hybrid institutions or hybrid coalitions, like we are trying to do here, and multiplying the forums of expression, generating debates, pushing one debate from the community to the local level, panchayat, village democracy, local democracy. It's a way to tackle the fact that we are in silos, we are in different kind of institutional backgrounds. So actually, even I really do think that the idea of, if we stick on the idea of the commons, we should enable this on the ground to create common spaces of expressions where everybody has a voice, and not only that in an ideal way, confronting the voice of everybody to everybody's, here. So it is not an easy task, and especially we are not very skilled in doing that. So that's why everybody needs support in that. And I do believe that, going for hybrid institutions or hybrid forums is a key to tackle that.
Shuvankar,
because also,
yeah, definitely. I do agree with Nicola that, and definitely that apart from the research that we are trying to do and generating results, what we should do is communicate the stakeholders, the common stakeholders that depend on the ecosystem in a much more efficient way, so that they understand why we are doing this and what's at stake, and what's at stake for them if such kind of disasters actually occur, and what can be the possible solutions in terms of mitigating those disasters? What's their point of view? How can they, what they think is the right way to do the mitigate the disasters or implement green infrastructure? I think that will be that's I think the way to go. And that might, combining our evidences that we provide and their point of view, combining both of them, and then we can present the idea to, in setting up the green infrastructures or disaster resilience stuff. I think that will be the way to go.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, Shuvankar. I think the key takeaway from your response is that, hybrid institutions that cut across disciplines, bring together a wide variety of people. And the point you made, Nicolas, about the notion of everybody needs to have a voice about how we proceed on the ground. I think that is a very important one. You also made this point in your presentation as well. We are way behind schedule, so I think we'll close here with an invitation to Dr. Erika Svendsen of USFS to provide us a synthesis of what we heard and discussed in this webinar today.
Thanks so much, Kamal, and to all the panelists for a truly brilliant discussion and panel. And hello, everyone from the shorelines of New York City on a very clear but windy day. Well, in a relatively short period of time, it seems like there has been a great advancement in our discourse and understanding of nature-based and resilient infrastructure, but some of it still remains aspirational, a hope for the future. And some of it, as our panelists have shared today, is well within our reach. But in the age of some clear uncertainties, perhaps it is only with the support and consideration of people that we can assure ourselves that we are on the right path. The panelists today shared with us that some of the most tangible things we can do is attend to the process of integrated planning and design as we draw upon available science, technology, and our own resources, and that we ensure that there's equity and dignity in all that we do, because this too is part of a risk mitigation strategy. And in this way, we seem to be seeking these structures that are collaborative in their approach, collaborative in their nature, cross-boundary, cross-sectors, and as folks have said today, that take solutions to scale, embracing the hybridity as a new form of governance. And the process, we find, matters as much as the outcome. There are many reasons to do this work, as the panelists have shared: biodiversity, importance of wildlife and livelihoods, well-being, and maybe even the economics are in our favor. Still, we have so much more to learn from ourselves as well as our technological inventions. We need the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view, and that there is strength in knowledge. It's often untapped in our most vulnerable places and people, the lived experience of those who are living on the front lines of change. And I think the example of the Fisher Coast really captured this quite well. And finally, two last points, in looking through a different lens. Our problems are big, but the solutions can be right in front of us if we look through new lenses. And I really appreciated the conversation about not abandoning our expertise and experience, but breaking free of our silos and leaning in towards interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. Finally, the call to integrate the gray, the green, the blue, and the human. Because as we seek to better understand disaster and its impacts, to build back better only with the gray and the green, we leave out this critical piece, the social infrastructure and the physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact with each other in everyday life. Thank you very much to all. I know we are due to wrap up soon. I just want to appreciate everyone once again and appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Svendsen. That was a very, very good summary. You brought it all together very nicely. So many quotable quotes in that summary, which we shall use in the wrap-up report of this webinar. With that, we would like to close this webinar, but by way of closing remarks, I just want to highlight some follow-up. Today in the chat box, there was a lot of conversation. We were not able to follow up on everything that was said in the chat boxes due to limitation of time, but there are many things that are coming up, and we would like you to continue to stay engaged with the CDRI, with USAID, USFS colleagues, the French Institute of Pondicherry. We are all going to work together on this. Can we have the next slide so that I can present that summary of next steps? So one thing I want to highlight is that COP26, which will be held in UK, Glasgow, will have nature-based solutions as one of the 5 focus areas. So, there is going to be a lot of discussion on this, challenging questions on how do we go beyond expressions of the desire to do something on it to actually doing it on scale. CDRI is due to launch a flagship report in 2022 with an intermediate product in 2021. So the thematic focus of this report is nature-based solutions. In the context of the flagship report, we will invite background papers, case studies. So please do reach out to CDRI, engage with us. We have a fellowship. Sandeep in the opening update provided information on fellowship program. So if there are researchers looking for some resources to supplement their ongoing work, to do focused work on nature-based solutions, please go to CDRI website. The last date of applying for the fellowships is 17th of January. You will not only have access to resources in terms of funding, but also access to a wide network of people to engage with. We are also working on national risk assessments in the context of infrastructure sectors, where we want to look at nature-based solutions. And all the work that we are going to do on infrastructure, whether it's on airports or power, we want to integrate nature-based solutions into it and not have a separate pillar on nature-based solutions and the rest of the sectors continue to do what they've been doing for decades. CDRI is organizing this webinar as a part of the ICDRI 2021 pre-event. The next event on which, so there was some discussion in the chat boxes today as well on health and health infrastructure. So we have a webinar coming up on 17th of December on health infrastructure resilience. What do we learn from the current pandemic and what is the road for the future? So with that, thank you very much. It's been a true pleasure working with all of you in the run-up to this event and during the event. Special thanks to the panelists, the team from USAFS, TRG, especially Pam, our colleague Balaji, and all the panelists who are here, and our team at the CDRI Secretariat as well, Ria Rahman et al. So thank you very much. With that, I would like to close it here. Thank you.